I'm here to talk about the creative process. I have been asked many times how I can keep up a streak of feeling creative, working on projects, and just following my muse. I've known a lot of people who have experienced creative block, sometimes for years at a time, and they often ask me for advice, and I actually feel I have a lot to say on this topic, so I decided to make a video about it. So, creativity is an interesting animal. We all have some. We don't always know how to express it, and there are a couple reasons for that, which I'll get into in a bit. But creative block can be caused by a lot of things, not just that. I would say that the main reasons people have creative blocks are either they don't know how they feel about something and therefore can't follow their muse. It's like they don't really hear it. They don't hear what's going on inside them. Or, more often than not, they have an inkling of what they want to do, what they want to create, but they just lack the motivation for whatever reason. They can't seem to get started. And I would say maybe a third reason that people experience creative block is maybe just a lack of connection to themselves. They're experiencing some kind of profound state of anxiety or dissociation, or they just simply can't be honest with themselves about what they're really feeling. And that is a very big problem for a creative person, because although there are many kinds of creativity and different ways that we can create things, almost all of it involves the heart in some way. And we don't always recognize that. Even very emotional people like myself, I'm a very emotional person, I sometimes get disconnected from those feelings. I get too wrapped up in things, and my creativity always takes a dive as a result. I'm always more productive when I feel more in touch with my feelings. So I'm going to be talking about those three main reasons for a creative block, and some of the things we can do about it. Some of the ways that we can express ourselves and get in touch with ourselves a little more. So the first reason I want to get into is getting in touch with the feelings and how we struggle to do that. And this is probably the hardest one for most people, and I'm sure a lot of people watching already understand why. We live in a society that's extremely dissociated, and although it's possible that that was true in the past, it does appear that this is only getting worse and worse, that more and more aspects of our humanity are taking a backseat role to these more abstract states of mind created by our technology and our lifestyle. For instance, an obvious one most people know is we spend a significant amount of time on the internet, and we communicate with people online, and we type stuff rather than saying it out loud. And that still carries a lot of emotion. We still have real experiences, real connections with people. But there is a human aspect of it removed. And this is something that I believe we're in the process of evolving alongside. So the way I see it is humanity hasn't really evolved to catch up with our own technology and the modern lifestyle. We still experience the world as though we're ancient beings. We haven't changed that much. We're still driven by carnal impulses and social things. And even if we have a kind of personality that doesn't place a lot of value on those things, they're still extraordinarily relevant to our experience, whether we want them to be or not. So, first things first, just acknowledging that is an incredibly important step. And in the acknowledgement of the wants and needs of the animal self, we'll start to notice that these three difficulties of finding motivation, listening to our innermost feelings, and knowing how to express these feelings are extremely connected. In fact, they're inextricably linked. When asking what the animal part wants, some of the time we're just going to get basic answers. We're going to get things like food, friendship, sense of community, sense of safety, and of course, some of the time that answer is going to be difficult because there are things we would rather not focus on, we'd rather not think about. There are aspects of the carnal being that we shun in society or even just within ourselves. And these aspects can't truly be silenced or gotten rid of. So what's really important here is being able to recognize them, being able to recognize all of these animal parts of the self, what they mean, where they come from, how they interconnect with each other. Because being honest with the self is directly related to this. It's being able to understand, who am I really? Who am I physically? Who am I psychologically? Who am I in my community? Maybe even, who am I spiritually? Who am I just to my family? All of these questions are directly influenced by our innermost desires and our relationship with the animal self in ways that they're not often very obvious, but our ability to create is directly impacted by this. So to return to the topic of our technology and our lifestyle interfering with this animal self, a large part of what we really want is to feel like an animal. And this isn't the same for everybody exactly. There are some things in common that all of us want, some fundamental needs. But being an animal is more than what we think it is. We tend to separate these ideas of the ape part, and then there's the, what would you call, maybe the superego part, the part that connects to society and wants to rise above those instincts. But the self, of course, is comprised of all the different parts of the psyche. We tend to separate and compartmentalize them. But at the end of the day, it's just animal nature to do exactly that. We are responding to our surroundings, to our emotions, according to our physical impulses and our instincts. Even the dissociation we experience is an aspect of the animal. And I know that's kind of contradiction, what I was saying before, but the thing is, we're not perfect. We're not perfectly made. We have many aspects of ourselves that are in conflict. The needs of the animal, the needs of society, and somewhere between there, the needs of the self, of the heart. These things are not always going to align. When they do align, we usually feel very productive, very happy, but most of the time we're sort of spinning plates trying to satisfy these needs, the needs of others and deeper needs that all too often are getting ignored, but have a tendency to surface when we least expect. Now, one of the most important things we can do is learn to recognize our own unique combination of selves. We have different compartments. We have parts that want to hide, parts that are more introverted. We have parts that are more extroverted that need to be around people. And we have different ways that we engage with the senses that are preferable to us. That, for example, you might have heard of different learning styles. Some people are tactile learners and some are more audio learners, and some people learn better in a group or alone, and then sometimes it depends on the project. Sometimes you prefer to work on your own most of the time, but when it comes to certain things you need people to bounce ideas off. So a very, very important part of getting to know the real you and how all these parts connect is to recognize where these lines have been drawn for you. And it's very unhelpful to compare yourself to others in this. We tend to go online and we read guides about, oh, okay, you need this much socializing, or you need to do things a certain way. You go to school, they teach you how to learn. All of these things clutter the mind. They don't give you the chance to know what your needs are. Your needs are never going to match somebody else's completely. Now, for a lot of creative people, a very, very important thing is being able to get in a groove. And this is something I experience regularly. It's that feeling of just being really present, really concentrating, really focused. I'm sure a lot of creative people know all too well what it's like to have that groove disturbed. So maybe you've been taking a couple of hours just to finally get into that headspace, and then something happens, somebody phones you, or you have to get up and do something for whatever reason, and sometimes you just go back to square one. And that is a problem that a lot of us face that's actually connected to motivation. And it's also connected to what I was saying before about learning about your own needs and the proportions of those needs. So what I mean is, I'll give myself as an example here. I often need to spend an hour just listening to music or daydreaming or looking at artwork. And I do this to get into a groove. This gets me into a sort of hyper-focused mode. And once I'm in that groove, I will switch over to some kind of work. Now, what work it is, that's actually dependent on one of the other issues, which is about listening to feelings, but I'll get back to that in a moment. So once I have presumably figured out what I want to do and I'm doing it, I personally need to maintain that groove to stay in it. So I do this by going back and forth between things. I'll open up social media, talk to a couple friends for a minute or two. I'll go back to working. Sometimes I have to have more than one project open at a time because I'm somebody who has not exactly a short attention span. I have a large attention span on the right days, but we'll say I have a very context-dependent attention span. It's either my full attention or none at all. And if it's none at all or very little attention, it's almost physically difficult for me to work. It feels like I'm depleting my life energy just to do the simplest task. And when I get like that, I'll often just get very tired and sort of grumpy and give up. But over the years I've learned a technique, which is what I mentioned, multitasking, I've learned that when I multitask, I become more productive. It's strange because I didn't understand this for a long time, but I had been burning myself out by focusing too heavily on certain things. I'd start a medley, for example, and I would be working on it 12 hours a day, just non-stop. I wouldn't eat sometimes. I'd just work. I'd wake up, all I'd think about is this medley. And it was pure joy, but I experienced a burnout after a couple of years of doing this that was so bad that it's taken me almost 5 years to recover completely from that. My creative output significantly dropped. And I've spent a lot of these years discovering things about myself. And one of those is about my attention span. And that circles back to what I was talking about getting in touch with the animal. Because the animal part of me, that just my nature, my truest nature, experiences things very intensely. Emotions, sensory things. And I had been tuning out my senses in order to be productive, or to do what people want me to do or need me to do, or just to complete things. And really what I was doing was I was working against the animal instead of with it. And what I do now is I've learned to recognize when I'm getting tired. I've taken steps to get more in tune with the body, to feel the sensations in the body. That used to be an inconvenience, but I'm starting to look at them differently now. I'm starting to look at them like a guide to be productive and creative. If I'm getting dizzy, if my blood pressure is going up, it means I'm very stressed, and rather than ignoring that, I will switch activities. I'll give my eyes a rest. I'll eat something, whatever it takes. And what makes me want to do that, because before I didn't want to do that at all, I just wanted to keep going, is I learned to care about it. I learned to care about these things by perceiving them as part of the creative process. So if I need to switch activities, I think, what a perfect opportunity for me to stop and contemplate. What am I going to do next? Maybe I'm working on a story. I think I have to step back. It's like you're zooming out. If you struggle with motivation, I've personally found that the antidote tends to be passion. And what I mean by passion is not necessarily what it sounds like. Passion is really just your ability to care about something. And it's like what I was talking about before. I didn't care about whether or not I was eating enough that day, that kind of thing. Because all I thought, art, I gotta work on this, right? Well, sometimes it can be the opposite too. You can have a general want to create something or to do something, but you don't care. You understand that it would be nice to create, and maybe you feel a kind of nostalgic sense, oh, I'd like to draw, I used to draw all the time, but you're disconnected from it. It's something that exists in a bubble somewhere up here. There's nothing connecting it to the core self. And a very important, perhaps essential part of maintaining your relationship with your muse and your creativity is learning how to care. Care about what you're doing. Not just what you're doing, more, maybe a better way of putting it, caring about why you're doing it. So, for instance, maybe you're working on a story and you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is what I want to make. You perhaps need to go a little bit deeper. Why do you want to make it? What are you trying to say? Otherwise, it's just kind of a nebulous idea that just stays there. It's like ice. And the only thing that's going to melt that ice and make that whole idea budge is finding that ray of sunlight. And that ray of sunlight is your muse. That's your sense of destiny or bliss or duty or whatever you want to call it, whatever works for you. When you experience it, the creative process becomes effortless. But people often suffer from a kind of blindness when it comes to that sunlight. We don't know where to look for it. We look for it in all the wrong places because we tend to drown it out with other voices. There's the voice of what you think you want over here, what you think you should want over here, what you actually want somewhere around here. So that's what I like to call triangulating the soul. So this is kind of how it works. Say, for example, you're going on a diet, right? This is a typical problem people have motivational issues with, what you think you should want is to never eat ice cream again. Which, God forbid. But yeah. What you think you want is to eat it all the time. You feel the craving. What you actually want is to eat it sometimes. Now, some people might say, oh, what you actually want is to eat it all the time. But that, in my opinion anyway, is a shallow perspective, because that doesn't take the whole being into account. It only takes this little infantile part into account. Yes, we all have that part in us. We have that thing that throws a tantrum when it can't get its way, that wants everything to be instant. We all have that. But that's not the whole you. There is a part of you that transcends it, that wants to be greater than the sum of its parts. And what we're doing here is we're trying to triangulate for that, because that's the part that creates. That's the part that's productive. That's the part that simultaneously acknowledges its feelings and the greater picture. Because, we wouldn't create if we didn't want to externalize. If we didn't have some reason to show the world what we do. We can fantasize all day, and maybe that would satisfy some of us. I enjoy it sometimes, just sitting there daydreaming. It's great, there's a whole world in there. But there is a reason why you want to get it out. There is a reason why you want other humans to see it. And it's not always easy to know what that reason is. And it's different for everyone, of course. There are some common reasons, like maybe you think you have a good opinion that the world needs to hear. Maybe you want to help or contribute. Maybe you are feeling very sorrowful and it's just a kind of exorcism. You paint something and all the feelings go into that painting. Some people it's like that. Maybe you feel like you're actually contributing to some kind of culture. Maybe you want to advance or rethink or recontextualize some kind of art style or situation. And sometimes they don't even need words, and this is kind of tricky because if you're not used to thinking without words, it might be harder to tease them out. But sometimes it's just a vague feeling, just a vague aesthetic washes over you, or a vague feeling of some kind of emotional palette that you want to express, and you realize that you can't express it in any other way than art. And sometimes you want to share that with others, or you want to see if others will understand you. I know for me personally, a large part of my motivation is, it's part of a more general interest. I have a very, very, very large interest in art and music. So I listen to a lot of music every day, I look at a lot of art every day, and ever since I was a child, I've often wanted certain pieces of music to exist. So, for example, I made this suite of flower waltzes, and there's currently 66 different waltzes, and each one is for a different type of flower. And the reason I created those was because when I was little, I fell in love with Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers, and I pictured how beautiful would it be to hear a different song for each flower. And I thought about, what does a rose sound like? What does a daffodil sound like? And that was fueled by this passion and almost by a curiosity. I was curious what these things would sound like, and I wanted to know. And I realized that's not out there. I'm never going to find that. But the imagination kept working, and I realized, well, this is what I think it would sound like. And I've got a keen interest in flowers too, that helps. But creativity is often like that. Sometimes somebody writes a book because it's the book they want to read. They think, oh, what would the perfect story be? And they have kind of a gestalt image of what that would be. What kinds of characters, what kinds of aesthetic, whatever it is. And then they realize, oh, I gotta write this. Suddenly they realize the whole book's already there. It's always been there. It's only that inclination, that desire to experience it that allowed them to begin. Now, where it gets trickiest and where the river really starts to run dry is when we experience profound dissociation, as I talked about earlier. And dissociation is essentially a feeling of being compartmentalized or disconnected from one's core self. The core self has been divided. And these two pieces of the whole, or however many pieces, are no longer communicating. The psyche is not a network in the same way. It's a maze. And for people experiencing that, and there are a lot of people experiencing that more than it would seem, it can be so unbelievably debilitating and confusing, because those people can have one day where they feel alive, very alive, motivated, free, and then the next day that's just gone, and they won't be able to retrace their steps, at least not easily. So, really, when this is happening, when you feel emotionally dried up, dead, numb, learning how to retrace the breadcrumbs of your heart, your psyche, that is the challenge. Because creativity, surprisingly, it is an automatic thing for most people. It's something we have in early childhood. It never really goes away unless our mental landscape is just getting too cluttered, whether you're bogged down by stress or you're just too busy, you're tired. Generally speaking, the only thing that gets in the way of your creativity, other than physical limitations, is when you're dissociated. And just to be clear, dissociation starts very young. Some people almost immediately, they go to school, they suffer, maybe they don't have a very good experience, maybe they have bad teachers who squash the creativity. That's something that can actually happen to a lot of kids. It could happen later, of course, too. Some people feel great up until high school or maybe just after, and then the real world sets in and they just get squashed by the stress. That is something that we often believe is permanent. We get this sense that there's no way to fix it, that you're going to be dissociated forever. And in fact, we generally don't even recognize when we are dissociated. But that's the number one creativity killer, I think, dissociation. Because everything involved in creativity requires that communication within the self. See, the thing is, everything you create, there's no form of art that isn't also a form of communication. Painting is communication. Dance is, even food is communication sometimes. Everything we can make. Some part of us is experiencing and imbuing kind of emotion. And in order to externalize emotion, you have to be able to internalize it. You have to be able to simulate within you. And when you're dissociated, it's almost like you can't translate what's going on. Part of your consciousness is occluded, and you're getting a kind of robotic facsimile of self. And consequently, you're also communicating that. And this may ring true for you. Perhaps you've had those days where you just feel like you're on autopilot. You're just going through life and going through the motions, but there's nobody home. The real you is somewhere very far back, not experiencing or trying their best not to experience. If you are experiencing this kind of mental state, and everyone does sometimes, to a degree, but if you're experiencing it often, it's important to understand that your creative block is caused by the lack of communication inside. It's not because you're broken or because you can't do it anymore. It's not because you've lost your muse. It's more like there's a cloud front covering your sun, and that cloud front has been there for a long time. And understanding this is helpful, because the last thing you want to do is feel guilty or insecure about your inability to create, because it's not actually anything to do with you as a person. Every kind of personality can create, and every kind of personality can become dissociated. And there are different types of dissociative states, and some of them make creating harder than others. When we take steps to look inward, we are put in touch, eventually anyway, with our true desires. And as I mentioned earlier, those are not always apparent. A lack of desire usually equates a lack of creativity. And an inability to perceive desire is the ice that's freezing you in place. When this occurs, the most important thing is to become inwardly flexible, to start perceiving things in more hues, less in black and white. We often ensnare ourselves with perception of self, perception of reality or others. These types of perceptions divide us internally. They compartmentalize us. They effectively block us from maneuvering and moving around our own mental landscape. They reroute us. They change the direction of the thoughts that travel. And the most important thing you can do, if you want to be creative, is to remove those walls. Allow the psyche to travel in all directions. So learning to recognize those walls is another important part of freeing the consciousness and enabling inner communication to take place. So really, if you're having a creative block, the most important thing you can do is start asking yourself questions. It's not going to be simple. It's probably not going to be fast, but that's the place to start. Start by asking, what do I really want? What do I think I want? What do I think I ought to want? What do others want from me? Do I want those same things? And when looking for your muse, again, it's more of a question of where, triangulating her. She's somewhere between these things. You have to be able to use a little bit of detective work to trace the truth that's inside you. Because when you're being your authentic self, you will feel freer, you'll feel more creative. The water will start flowing, the ice will melt. It will happen joyfully. It's a childlike experience. When the ice melts, creating becomes effortless. It's no longer work, it feels like play. And if we're honest with ourselves, we begin to understand what is work and what is play. Because the only real difference between those things is desire. Where does my heart want to be? What would I be doing right now if I could be doing anything? Where would I be right now if I could be anywhere? Who would I be right now if I could be anyone? Though finding the Muse is not necessarily going to be the path of least resistance. In fact, there is work involved a lot of the time, even when you're creating these joyful projects, even when the water's flowing, it's still going to be work. And just admitting that, acknowledging that is important. But getting to a space where the work feels natural and joyful, that's what's important here. So be honest with yourself. What do you enjoy doing? What did you used to enjoy doing? And has that changed? Where does that creativity want to go? Where does that river want to flow? Maybe it's not where it seems. Maybe it's something you've even been running away from, or something that seems impossible. Maybe you're not even being challenged enough, and that's part of the problem. Either way, it's important to look inward.